So, let's talk about airplanes. Hello and welcome to this video lesson where you get to learn about the basics of aviation and the principles of flight. I am your host, Romyl Suarez, and today susubukan kong explain and i-summarize lahat ng naging lessons namin throughout this semester, while also being entertaining at the same time. Hopefully. Before we start, let's define what an aircraft is. Aircraft are not the same as airplanes. Well, more like the word aircraft is the term that we use to generally describe any vehicles or machines that is capable of flight. So an airplane is a kind of aircraft, and this is an aircraft. Well, this is not an aircraft. Pretty straightforward, right? No. There are four categories of an aircraft. We have lighter than air, we have fixed wing or airplanes, we have rotorcraft, and lastly, we have gliders. We're good? You're good? You're following along? Right, let's move on. Now, let's start this video lesson by tackling the history of flight and the invention of the airplane itself. However, since history is a long and pretty boring subject at times, I'm sorry history teachers, but I will try in this video to be as concise and short as possible while also pinpointing the important parts of the history of flight. Because after all, how did this become this? So, let's talk about the history of flight. So, the history of flight starts from the very beginning with Leonardo da Vinci's in the 1500s. So, Leonardo da Vinci sparked the idea of flying machines. Despite sketching various designs, his flying machines never flew because his designs were flawed. Essentially, Leonardo da Vinci started sketching different designs for a man-powered flying machine. I say flying machine, not an aircraft, because his ideas is only stopped as a concept. It is great in concept, however, in real-life application, it is practically impractical. Kasi yung design ni Leonardo da Vinci, yung mga aircraft, mga flying machines niya involves human power. Imagine having artificial wings in both your arms and you're gonna flap it to fly. And as you all know, that's gonna exert a lot of force and a lot of energy to a person. So, as stated here in 1955, a mathematician, physicist, and inventor named Robert Hooke concluded the human body does not possess this strength to power artificial wings. Well, it is literally impossible to fly using artificial wings because after all, hindi kahit na napaka-fit mong tao, well, paano kung napagod ka? Paano kung ubos ka na ng energy? How did you land? And stuff like that. So, Leonardo da Vinci, however, because of his ideas, kahit na hindi siya na-apply in real world and hindi naging successful yung pag-invent niya ng concept niya ng flying machines, siya yung unang-unang tao na nag-spark ng idea of a possible flying machine. Up next in our period here is in 1783, we have the brothers Joseph Michael and Jacques Etienne Montgolfier. So, they were inventors of the first hot air balloon. So, their hot air balloon was powered by a hand-fed fire and a paper and surfcraft. So, it rose from 500 vertical feet, so it's pretty high, and traveled 5.5 miles over half an hour. So, for the very first hot air balloon, it is very impressive talaga na naka-invent sila ng something na ganito. And 10 days later, Jacques Alexander Charles and Nicholas Louis Robert upped the ante, and their balloon powered by hydrogen gas traveled 2.25 miles and stayed aloft more than 2 hours. So, ito yung invention nila Joseph M. Jacques Etienne Montgolfier. And ito yung ginamit nila Jacques and Nicholas to up the ante 10 days later. So, yung design ni George Cayley involves a glider. So, a glider essentially is a fixed-wing aircraft na meron siyang malaking surface na nagka-catch ng air para mag-glide slowly to the ground. So, yung invention ni George Cayley sa flying machine niya, which is a glider, involves the control of the movement of the body where you can lean left, right, forward, or even backwards to control. And sometimes, meron din siyang control in the back to control the flow of the air para mas makontrol niya yung glider niya. But, ito yung sinasabi ko na idea sana ni Leonardo, pero it didn't apply very well. Kasi yung invention ni Leonardo, mas inuuna niya kung paano mo muna mapapaangat yung isang tao from the air. Well, in George Cayley's case, naisip niya na why not start from the top and glide down to the bottom. So, yun yung invention ni George Cayley with his glider. And next, we have the German engineer Otto Lilienthal, who studied aerodynamics and worked to design a glider that would fly. He was the first person to design a glider that could fly a person and was able to fly long distances. So, yung kay George Cayley kasi, yung invention niya, sure it kind of worked, pero it didn't work 100%. But the idea and the concept is there. However, hindi siya masyadong effective as a glider. Well, here, Otto, as we can see here, he invented a glider which is more of a similar design with Leonardo da Vinci, but that includes, as we can see here, two surfaces where the glider could catch the air. So he was fascinated by the idea of flight based on his studies of birds and how they fly. He wrote a book on aerodynamics that was published in 1989, and this text was used by the Wright brothers as the basis of their designs. So yung ginawa ni Otto Lilienthal is isa sa naging main influence to the invention of the very first biplane by the Wright brothers. So moving on again to 1891, we have Samuel Langley, who was an astronomer and realized that power was needed to help a man fly. So, lahat ng naging idea so far na natakal natin includes a manpower, but hindi siya practically flying. So, Samuel Langley wanted something of an aircraft na nakakasustain ng sarili niya with its own power. So, na-realize niya na he needed to build a plane which he called an aerodrome that included a steam-powered engine. So, ito yon yung steam-powered engine niya. However, meron kasing problema when it comes to this kind of idea. Well, the concept again is very, very interesting. However, steam-powered engines at that time were very, very heavy. And they're not the most very efficient kinds of engine when it comes to flying aircraft. So, in 1900s, we have Orville and Wilbur Wright, who were the deliberate in their quest for flight. So, gusto nila talaga na makaroon ng konting contributions in the invention of flight itself, because in this period talagang one of the main targets of humanity was to fly. And first, they read about the early developments of flight. They decided to make a small contribution to the study of flight control by twisting their wings in flight. So, sila yung nag-start na mag-invent ng parang way para ma-control mo yung sarili mo mid-flight. Because in the modern aircraft, we have our planes that can fold, which can dictate the direction and the lift of the modern aircraft. So, sila yung nag-experiment on that kind of idea. Then, they began their tests with a kite. They learned about the wind that could help the flight and how it could affect the surface once up in the air. So, kasi mahirap kasi mag-experiment ng flight kapag wala ka pang sariling aircraft. So, how do you experiment? And plus, it is very risky to test mid-flight. So, naisip nila, why not make a kite that is capable of staying in the air and study the behavior of the air and the wings and the kite itself based on the testing in mid-flight. So, ginawa nila yung similar na method ni George Cayley where they would try to change the shape of their kites to know ano ba yung mas pinaka-effective na shape or pinaka-effective na design para mag-stay afloat in the air or para ma-sustain yung flight nila and be stable as much as possible. So they spent 3 years testing and learning about the gliders that could be controlled at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. So 2 years later, in 1902, they designed and used a wind tunnel to test the shapes of the wings and tails of the gliders. So what is a wind tunnel? Well, a wind tunnel, imagine just a big cylindrical place, big tunnel that has a big flow of air. So ang ginawa nila is they tested their own kites in a wind tunnel, and doon nila na-dictate kung paano yung magiging control and paano yung magiging balance and everything na gagamitin nila na data para mag-invent ng proper wings and proper gliders. So in 1902, with the perfected glider shape, they finally perfected it. They turned their attention on how to create a propulsion system that would create the thrust needed to fly. So again, dito na talaga nagko-culminate lahat ng naging ideas from the previous periods. So, the gliders, which from George Cayley and Otto Lilienthal, and the engine, which came from Mr. Langley. So dito na nila naisip pa na pwede din talagang maging possible ang engine. However, sa case kasi ni Mr. Samuel Langley, yung steam and powered engine niya is too heavy and masyadong inefficient yung machine to sustain a flight. So, mas madami yung na-provide na weight larger than the lift. So, at that time, 12 horsepower is really impressive. So, ito yung engines na ginamit nila. And with 12 horsepower, they were able to try and test flight their very first flyer that lifted from the level ground to the north of Big Kill, Devil Hill, North Carolina. On December 17, 1903, 1 year after that, the first heavier-than-air flight traveled 120 feet in 12 seconds. Now, it's 12 seconds, and it's only 120 feet. But may I remind you, this is the very first heavier-than-air flight in human history. Well, what I mean by heavier-than-air flight kasi is, as we discussed earlier nga, the invention ng Montgolfier brothers ng flying balloons, yung aircraft nila is way more lighter than the air, which is why nagfo-float sila in the air. Well, yung invention ng Wright brothers is heavier than air because we have the machines and the components, and we have the passenger or the pilot itself. So it is definitely heavier than air, but it still can fly kahit na mas mabigat siya sa air. So the two brothers took turns flying that day with the fourth and last flight covering 850 feet in 15 seconds. So they did four test runs in total, and in total they covered 850 feet in 59 seconds. You know, that's really impressive. But after all, their flyer, they named their aircraft, the flyer, was too unstable and very hard to control. So the brothers returned to Dayton, Ohio, where they worked for 2 or more years perfecting their design. And finally, on October 5, 1905, Wilbur piloted the Flyer 3 for 39 minutes. So as we can see, yung invention ng flight, nag-start talaga siya in this part of the idea of what if man could fly. It started with Leonardo da Vinci's design, but the design demands human power. And we moved to George Cayley, where he invented his very own glider, and Otto Lilienthal, which improved on that glider, and we have Samuel Langley, which sparked the idea of what if we move on from gliders and we put machines or engines on the wings and let the aircraft fly itself without the manpower. And so Wright brothers compiled all of those ideas from the previous decades and invented the very first heavier than air flying aircraft. So up next in our topic is the basic lift and aerodynamics. So as we can remember kanina in our history lesson, yung Wright brothers is ginawa nila is nagtest sila ng mga gliders nila and wings in an air tunnel, and that air tunnel is constantly flowing air into their gliders. Now, there's a reason for that, and that reason is for testing the lift capabilities and the aerodynamics of their design. So, first of all, what is the basic principles of aerodynamics? So, in an aircraft, we have 4 forces that is applied every time it is flying. So, first is the forward thrust or the forward force, which is what we call the thrust. And the opposite force of that thrust is what we call a drag. And the drag is just the force or the vortex that is being produced kapag nag-i-slice yung aircraft in the air. And we have the two other forces in the vertical axis, which is what we call the lift and the weight. So weight is just the application of gravity in the aircraft itself. As we all know what gravity is and what weight is, ito lang yung pag-pull ng mass ng isang object sa surface ng Earth. So that is the weight force of the aircraft. And the other force that is being applied kapag lumilipad ang aircraft is the lift, yung pagtaas ng aircraft. Now, similar to the forward thrust and the drag of the aircraft, yung lift then is meron this opposite force niya din ang weight. Because after all, kapag tumataas ka ng air, na-apply pa rin yung gravity sa aircraft mo. So let's start by tackling the 5 main components of the aircraft. Starting off from the the biggest part of the aircraft itself, which is the fuselage. That is the main body of the aircraft, from the nose up until here. That is the fuselage of the aircraft. Next here with the fuselage is the empennage of the aircraft. Now here in the empennage, there are three parts in the empennage. Well, more like 2 parts of the empennage. We have 2 horizontal stabilizers, these 2 little wings here, and we have 1 vertical stabilizer. They call it horizontal and vertical stabilizer because kasi we have here are the wings of the aircraft, but these two and this 1 vertical stabilizer is what keeps the aircraft stable and balanced mid-flight. So in the empennage, we also have different parts here. Hindi siya masyado nakikita sa mismong figure, but we have here the rudder and the elevators. Now, we're gonna discuss the purpose of the rudders and the elevators later on. Moving on from the empennage, we have the 2 main wings of the aircraft. So in the wings, there are also parts in the aircraft where we will tackle later on when we were going to discuss the different directions the aircraft can fly. We have here are the landing gears that is used for, well, para makapagtakbo siya sa runway and para makapag-land siya. So next, the part na reason for the forward thrust is the power plant. So in this design of the aircraft, there are 2 power plants because this aircraft itself is a very big aircraft. But there are also other designs of aircraft where there are only 1 kinds of power plants, or sometimes there are even aircraft that have no power plants, and that's what we call gliders. But kompleto pa rin sila ng empennage and the wings and the fuselage and all. Wala lang silang power plant. Now, the power plant provides, as we said kanina, it provides the forward thrust of the plane. So as gaya din na sabi natin, the heavier the plane is, the more lift it needs and the more thrust it needs. So Kaya dalawa yung power plant na kailangan nito is because look at the size of this thing, it's pretty big. So, kailangan niya ng madaming power and madaming forward thrust para madala yung aircraft in the air. Now, we have here are the two main parts, which is the wings, the very reason for the flight of the aircraft. So, in a wing, ito yung dahilan ng lift ng isang aircraft. Because in the part of the aircraft, there are two parts in each side of the wing. We have the ailerons and we have the flaps. So in here, the ailerons here are the very reason for the movement of rolling. Now, we're gonna discuss the movement of rolling later on, but first let's move on here with the flaps. And the flaps is the very reason for the increased lift of the aircraft. So essentially what happens here in the wings is, let's say that the wings here is like that, parang ganyan, straight lang siya. So kapag meron ka ng sapat na thrust meron ka ng sapat na momentum for the aircraft, yung flaps ng wings is mag-fold downwards yan, which would cause the air to flow downward, creating our lift. Now, there are more than details para mag-provide ng lift, pero essentially that is the idea behind the flaps and behind the reason for the wings. So, the important note to say here is the fuselage here. There are different designs of the fuselage. So obviously there are different kinds of aircraft in the world, pero there are different constructions of the aircraft depending on the design or the requirement required for the scale of the aircraft. So we have three different aircraft structures. We have the monocoque, the semi-monocoque, and the truss structure. Now, let's start with the truss structure. So a truss structure, as we can see right now in the screen, truss structure is parang similar lang siya sa design ng mga typical Cessna or ng mga iba pang aircraft na more on like in the square shape na aircraft. So in the truss structure, we have two parts, which is the struts and we have the longerons. Now the struts are the cross parts of the aircraft, which provide the supports to the longerons. Now yung longerons is sila yung nagpro-provide ng shape and as we can say, ng shape, and sila yung nagkikip ng structure ng mismong aircraft, while the struts provide the support that it needs para ma-keep yung structure in place. Now, there are other truss structure na hindi sila masyadong square type, pero meron pa silang additional parts, which is the bulkhead, which is a half cylindrical, a half circle, or more like an elliptical shape, and stringers, which is little strands of sheets of fabrics of metal that provides the shape and additional support of the structure. And we have next is the monocoque. Now, as we can see here in this aircraft, this is a monocoque designed aircraft, because as we can see in the monocoque design, the bulkhead here is not half-shaped circle. It is a full circle all around inside the structure, and inside the bulkhead and along with the bulkhead are the formers, which is yung nagpro-provide ng extra support, and siya din yung nagkikip ng shape ng aircraft. So yung bulkhead is the main support, and yung formers is yung nagkikip ng shape ng isang monocoque design aircraft. And we have the stress skin, which is the cover ng buong aircraft. And we have here another design here is a semi-monocoque. So, monocoque is just similar to a monocoque design. However, instead of just the bulkhead, formers, and the skin itself, meron din siyang padagdag na stringers. Now, these stringers are needed para mas ma-provide na mas stable and mas powerful yung gilid ng aircraft. Because, minsan hindi kasi ganun kalakas yung support kapag monocoque design lang ang isang aircraft. Now, kanina din minention natin na ang isang aeroplano kaya din niyang mag left and right, forward and backward, similar to a car. So, meron pang isang direction ang isang aircraft na pwede siyang pupunta, which is up and down. So, we can achieve that by using the elevators in the horizontal stabilizers. And what we call this motion is called pitching. We move up, we pitch up in the air, or we pitch down in the air, depende sa altitude na gusto nating ma-achieve in the aircraft. Because sa isang typical na sasakyan, okay na yung level mo is nakadepende na sa level mo in the road. However, in the air, kailangan mong i-balance kung nasaan ka, in up or down, lalo na for take-off, for going up in the air, or para bumaba ka for the landing. So, we can now move left and right, forward and backwards, and up and down. However, there is one specific movement which is called rolling, where we can roll the aircraft like this. So, we achieve rolling by using the ailerons in the aircraft. As I said, di ba kanina, meron tayong dalawang parts of the wing. We have the flaps and the ailerons. So, the ailerons provides the function para mag-roll ang isang aircraft. So, kapag ito, nag-flap siya dito, pupunta siya dyan. Pag nag-flap siya dyan, gaganyan. Or kapag nag-flap dito, gaganyan. And depende sa direction ng pag-flap ng ailerons, nakadepende din yun sa pag-roll ng aircraft. Now, we use this para ma-move natin yung wings natin in different directions, because after all, paano natin ma-direct ang isang aircraft kung pag ganyan lang yung daan niya, di ba? So gagamit din tayo ng other directions para kapag magti-take turn tayo, gaganyan tayo. So that's a roll and a yaw at the same time. There we go. And kung gusto mo umakyat, we're gonna apply a little pitch up in the air. We're gonna turn, roll, up. So, ganun lang siya. So, yun yung tatlong directions na kayang gawin ng isang aircraft. So, a typical vehicle can only go forward, backwards, left, and right. But in aircraft, can go forward, backwards, left, right, roll, and up and down. So that's it. But kapag ang isang aircraft, however, is nagpipitch yan, or kapag nagti-take off yan, may iba ang center of gravity yan. Now, what is a center of gravity? So, center of gravity is a point at which the entire weight of that body is assumed to be concentrated. So, everything has a center of gravity. Kahit tayo mga tao, meron tayong sariling center of gravity, pero hindi lang natin na-realize. Pero, imagine kapag naglalakad tayo on a very tight rope. Of course, gaganon tayo, diba? And we're gonna try to balance ourselves para hanapin yung, guessed it, center of gravity. So, that is similar to the aircraft. You need to balance your center of gravity para stable yung pag-flight mo. Kasi kapag umakyat ang isang aircraft, let's say ang center of gravity niya is here because ito yung pinaka mabigat na part. However, kapag ang center of gravity ng isang aircraft, mababago yan. Kapag nag-take off tayo, malilipat yan sa baba. Kasi kung ano yan, kung ang center of gravity natin nag-stay lang diyan, mahihirapan tayong umakyat kasi nandiyan pa rin yung force na pababa. So move yan there. And of course, kailangan natin i-balance yung center of gravity natin in our roll. So that is also one of the purpose of the roll, to stabilize the aircraft, kasi hindi ka naman lilipad ng ganyan o hindi ka rin lilipad ng ganito. So of course there. And of course, roll is also used for, trick shots, barrel roll, and all those stuff. So yeah, we have the four forces of the aircraft: the forward thrust, the drag, the gravity, and the lift. We have the three directions, which is the roll, the pitch, and the yaw. And we have the center of gravity, which applies depende kung ano yung position or ano yung orientation ng aircraft. So before we tackle the principles of flight, first, let's tackle the structure of the atmosphere. So as we all know, our atmosphere is composed of different gases, specifically 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and 1% of those are other gases. Now, these gases, kahit na pares silang mga gas, they're still different lalo na when it comes to their weight. Now, some gases are lighter than others, and some gases are heavier than others. And some gases that are lighter than others reside in the higher altitude in our atmosphere. Meanwhile, yung mga mas mabibigat na 21% na oxygen is nagre-reside sa surface ng Earth. So, dahil doon, isipin natin, kahit na ang gases is just a gas, they still have mass. Hence, since meron silang mass, nag-a-apply pa rin sa kanila yung effects ng gravity. Thus, yung mga mas mabibigat na atoms na gases, and yung mga mas magagaan is ganito. Magkahiwalay sila based on the lower or the heavier and the lighter. Now about the atmospheric pressure. Since atmospheric pressure at any altitude is due to the weight of the air. Now, obviously, magaan yung mga air na nasa taas compared sa mga air na nasa baba. So yung air na makukuha natin, or the pressure na makukuha natin in the higher altitude are less dense and less pressurized than what we will get on the ground. That is why kapag lumilipad ang isang aircraft, it is ideal na lumipad sila in a good level where the air is somewhat light and mababa lang yung pressure para madali sila maka-glide or maka-take flight in the air. So a atmospheric pressure can be measured using a barometer. We can use that using a mercury, and makikita natin yung standard sea level and compare that to the standard sea level pressure. So same goes with the atmospheric density. Now, yung atmospheric density, the higher you get, the less the density of the air, kasi nga mas spread out na sila since they are lighter and the pressure is less compared sa nasa baba. So now, let's talk about the principles of flight itself. Now, sa principles ng flight, there are two concepts or theories na pwede nating ma-apply in order to understand how lift or flight is being generated on an aircraft. Now, there are two types of concepts. There is the Bernoulli's principle, and there is the third law of motion by Newton. So, first, let's start with Bernoulli's principle. So, Bernoulli's principle is just, in layman's term, is just the difference of pressure between the upper portion and the lower portion of the airfoil. As we discussed nga kanina with the parts of the airfoil has two parts in the front and the back. So, we have the leading edge and the trailing edge. Now, yung raindrop shape ng aircraft ay ng airfoil is wala siyang masyadong difference when it comes to the difference in pressure. Wala siyang masyadong nako-contribute. However, yung angle ng pagkakagawa ng isang airfoil is yung nagiging reason kung bakit nagkakaroon ng pressure difference in the air. Now, in the upper portion ng airfoil, meron tayong low pressure and the lower portion ng airfoil, meron tayong high pressure. Now, why is that? Nag-generate siya dahil kahit na, di ba na-discuss natin na yung mga hangin, I mean, gases sa baba is lahat sila mabibigat and high pressure. However, because of the difference in speed and in the upper and lower part, nagkakaroon ng difference in pressure din when it comes to the two parts ng airfoil. So, dahil nga napakabilis ng takbo ng isang aircraft when having a takeoff, nakakaroon ng difference in speed dahil nga sa angle ng airfoil. Now, dito kasi nagta-travel pa siya ng mabilis. Nagta-travel pa siya, bababa pa siya, and pupunta siya sa likod. While however, kapag yung hangin nasa taas siya, aangat lang siya pababa, and ganun lang yung motion niya. While sa pababa, mabagal siya kasi yan. Kaya meron siyang low and high pressure dahil nga sa nangyayaring ganun na difference in speed. So dahil doon, nagkakaroon ng lift dahil sa difference in pressure ng isang aircraft. Now, kung isipin natin, hindi siya masyadong simple kasi, well, in Bernoulli's principle kasi, it's just a concept, and plus, mas lalo natin siya maintindihan kapag tinignan natin siya more in a mathematical and logical rather than a logical sense. Now, if we want to look at it in a very logical sense, we need to take a look at Newton's third law of motion. So, Newton's third law of motion states that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So pwede natin siya ma-apply sa aircraft natin. Kasi, di ba, discuss na natin kanina na the aircraft, meron siyang apat na forces, and two of those forces, meron silang dalawang opposite forces, of course, respectively. So, we have the thrust, we have the lift. So, the thrust, opposite force niya is the drag, yung hampas ng hangin when it comes to the aircraft. Kapag nag-forward siya, merong hampas ng hangin, yun yung nagpe-prevent sa aircraft from going faster, and yun yung nagpupull. Yun yung friction ng air sa surface ng aircraft. Nagpupull siya. So, and the lift, yung paangat niya, and of course, lahat ng bagay na merong mass, nag-a-apply lagi yan ang gravity. So, meron siyang opposite reaction. Kapag umangat siya, meron siyang na-apply na gravity kasi merong mass ang aircraft natin. So, magagamit natin yung same principle ng Newton's third law when learning about the principle of production of lift. Now, kanina we discussed na meron ang wings ng aircraft natin, meron silang flaps, right? So, first, let's talk about the upwash and the downwash of the flow of the air. Now, yung upwash flow ng air is yung paangat na flow ng air, and yung downwash is just yung pababa na flow ng air. Very, very self-explanatory. However, because the difference nga ng angle ulit ng airfoil natin, so as you can see, yung angle talaga ng airfoil is yung nagbibigay ng difference when it comes to production of lift. So dahil sa difference ng angle ng yung hampas ng hangin mula sa baba, nagpo-produce siya ng force pababa. Now, kapag yung flaps ng aircraft nag-curve pa yan ng lalo, yung hampas ng hangin, pupunta siya dyan and bababa siya lalo. Now, dahil sa third law of motion ni Newton, dapat since merong force na na-apply pababa, dapat opposite nung pababang force, meron ding opposite na force na paangat. And yun yung pag-generate natin ng lift. So, sabi nga natin kanina, diba, na kahit na ang air is hangin siya, meron pa rin siyang mass. Kasi meron pa rin siyang atom, so meron pa rin siyang mass. So, kahit na yung air na yan, and since yung aircraft natin is nagka-travel siya ng napakabilis and malakas yung hampas ng air sa airfoil, malakas yung force na naproproduce ng pagbaba ng air sa surface. Kaya dahil doon meron naproproduce na lift sa opposite ng pagbaba ng hangin, which is our lift. So, dahil sa hampas ng hangin, nagkakaroon tayo ng lift, and dahil sa pag-flap ng ng flaps, sa pag-curve ng flaps, mas lalo na i-improve yung force na yon, yung downward force na yon, hence mas lalo na i-improve yung lift ng aircraft. So, generally, yun lang naman talaga yung two theories na ginagamit ng mga engineers ngayon in order to describe the production of lift. Obviously, there are more technical side of things. Meron pa rin mga equations, meron pa rin mga other scientific explanations. But however, for this video simplicity's sake, sinubukan kong maging simple and as specific as possible without making too much confusion in the long run. Now because of that, nalaman na natin kung ano yung production of lift, and now we have finally reached the end of our video. So, yun lang naman talaga yung lesson natin for this video, and I hope madami tayong natutunan in this video, and I hope na somewhat, kahit na napakagulo akong magsalita and minsan mabilis and mahirap ako sundan, sana madami kayong natutunan in my own video, and yeah. So that is it. I hope sana nag-enjoy kayo, and thank you for watching, and yeah, I am Romyl Suarez, and thank you for watching this video.